On a cold Wednesday afternoon, an 18-year-old girl walked out of her high school, got into her car, and drove out of the parking lot. She had a little cousin waiting to be picked up. She had a shift to get to that evening. She had a boy whose name she had written across the pages of her diary more than 100 times. She had every reason in the world to come home that night. She never did. And more than 26 years later, after a conviction, a worldwide sensation, a release, a reversal, and a courtroom battle that still has not ended, one question continues to sit there with no honest answer. What truly happened to Hae Min Lee? Before we go one step further, I want you to do something for me. Wherever you are in the world right now, type it in the comments. Tell me the town, the city, the country you are watching from, and tell me what time it is where you are right at this moment. I want to see just how far this story has traveled, because by the time we reach the end of it, I promise you will understand why people across the entire planet still cannot let this case go. The man the state of Maryland convicted of her murder is walking free today. Not in prison. Not on the run. Free, living an ordinary life, while the people who loved Hae Min Lee are still waiting for an answer that may never come. And how he got there is one of the strangest, most unsettling stories in the history of American justice. If you care about the cases the world rushed past before the truth ever surfaced, the ones that got reopened, re-argued, and never truly resolved, then hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. This channel exists for exactly these stories. The forgotten ones. The unfinished ones. The ones that still deserve an answer. Now let me take you all the way back to the beginning. It is a cold Wednesday in the middle of January, in the final year of the 1990s. The place is Baltimore County, in the state of Maryland. At a public school called Woodlawn High School, an 18-year-old senior is finishing her school day exactly the way she had finished hundreds of days before it. Her name is Hae Min Lee. The people who loved her called her Hae. She had been born in South Korea at the start of the 1980s, and she came to the United States as a young child. Her family settled in Maryland and built a new life there, the way so many immigrant families do, with long hours and quiet sacrifice and enormous hope pinned on their children. By her senior year of high school, Hae had become the kind of student that teachers remember for years and that classmates naturally gather around. She played field hockey. She played lacrosse. She held down a part-time job to help bring money into her household, which is no small thing for a teenager carrying a full-course load. She interned for one of the language teachers at her school, a teacher who would later describe her as a genuinely kind spirit, the sort of young person who made a room feel warmer simply by being in it. And like so many people her age, Hae kept a diary. Hers was not neat or careful. It was raw, messy, and honest, filled with the real and tangled business of being 18 years old. There was heartbreak in those pages. There was hope. There was the slow, confusing, beautiful work of trying to figure out who you are and who you want to become. She wrote about her friends. She wrote about her family. She wrote about the future she assumed she had all the time in the world to reach. She had a younger brother named Young, who adored her and who would one day spend his entire adult life fighting for her in courtrooms he never asked to enter. She had a little cousin she looked after often, a child who trusted her completely. The people who knew Hae kept saying the same thing about her, again and again, in the years that followed. She had a way of making other people feel like they mattered. She paid attention. She showed up. She was reliable in a way that you could build your day around. Remember that word. Reliable. It is going to matter more than almost anything else in this story. Because in the winter of that final year of the 90s, Hae was also navigating the end of a complicated relationship. For a while, she had been quietly dating a fellow senior at Woodlawn. He was well-liked, easy to talk to, the kind of student that the whole school seemed to know by name. But their relationship had been kept mostly hidden. Both families came from traditional backgrounds, and a teenage romance that crossed cultural and religious lines carried a pressure that neither of them fully controlled. So they kept it quiet. They kept it between themselves. And then, in the last days of December, the two of them broke up. For Hae, that chapter was already closing, and she was ready to close it. She had begun seeing someone new, a young man she had met through her part-time job, a few years older than her. And she fell hard. We know exactly how hard, because she wrote it down in her own hand. In her diary, she wrote his name over and over again, more than 100 times on a single page, and then she counted every single one of them. She rewrote her online profile to make him the centerpiece of her life. The very last words she ever wrote in that diary, on the night before everything changed forever, were a simple sentence telling him that she loved him. That is who Hae Min Lee was. Not a case number. Not a headline. Not a name on a courtroom document. She was an 18-year-old girl standing right in the middle of her own story, surrounded by people who loved her, with absolutely no idea how little of that story she had left to live. Let me walk you through that final ordinary day, because every hour of it matters. That Wednesday in January was a full one for Hae. After the final school bell, she had responsibilities lined up. First, she needed to pick her young cousin up from daycare and make sure the child got home safely. After that, she was scheduled for a long evening shift at her part-time job. This was her routine. This was the dependable rhythm of her life. A classmate later remembered seeing her in the school hallway in the early afternoon, at around 2:15. There was nothing strange about the moment. Nothing seemed off. Nothing about Hae suggested fear, or worry, or that anything in the world was wrong. She looked exactly like a teenager at the end of an ordinary school day. Hae walked out to the school parking lot, got into her car, a compact sedan from the late 1990s, and drove away from Woodlawn High School. That is the last confirmed sighting of Hae Min Lee alive. Now here is where that word, reliable, comes roaring back. Because by 3:30 that same afternoon, only about an hour later, her family already sensed that something was deeply wrong. Hae had not arrived to collect her little cousin from daycare. For most teenagers, being late might mean nothing at all. For Hae, it was almost unthinkable, because she simply did not let people down, and she especially did not let down a child who was counting on her. And then she did not show up for her evening shift either. 2 missed obligations, back to back, both completely out of character for her. The people who loved Hae did not sit around making excuses for the silence. They did not assume she had simply lost track of time. They knew her too well for that. That very same day, they contacted the police and reported her missing. And then came the silence. The terrible, suffocating silence. For 4 entire weeks, Hae's family lived inside the worst kind of waiting that exists. There was no body. There was no crime scene. There was no note, no phone call, no ransom demand, no sighting, nothing. Just an absence where their daughter and sister used to be, and no way on earth to make the not knowing stop. Imagine the cruelty of those 28 days. Every ringing phone a spike of hope and dread at the same time. Every knock at the door a question with no answer. A family frozen between the desperate prayer that she was still alive somewhere and the slowly growing fear of what the silence really meant. Before we step into how that silence finally broke, and it broke in the worst possible way, I have a small favor to ask, and then we get right back into it. If you are the kind of person who feels this, who actually cares about the human being at the center of a true crime story and not just the mystery, then do me one quick favor right now and tap the like button on this video. I know it sounds small, but it genuinely pushes this story out to more people who care the same way you do, and it costs you absolutely nothing. It is the single biggest way you can help Hae's story be remembered. Go ahead and tap it, and then let us get straight back to Baltimore, because everything is about to change. The silence broke on the 9th day of February. That afternoon, a man pulled his vehicle over near a wooded stretch of a park on the west side of Baltimore, and he walked in among the trees. He was not searching for anything. He was not part of any official effort. He simply stepped into that woodland for his own ordinary reasons, and in the undergrowth, beneath the bare winter branches, he found something that no person is ever prepared to find. Partially buried in the cold ground, hidden beneath a thin and hurried layer of soil and dead leaves, was the body of a young woman. It was Hae Min Lee. She had been placed in a shallow grave, only a few inches deep in some places. She was still wearing the same clothes she had worn to school on the day she vanished, nearly 4 full weeks earlier. For 28 days, she had been lying there in that park while her family searched and prayed and slowly broke apart. That park has a long and grim reputation in the city of Baltimore. For decades, it had been known as a place where bodies were discarded, a quiet and overgrown corner of the city with a dark history attached to it. To a stranger, an outsider with no knowledge of the area, the location might look random, like a spot chosen in a panic by someone with nowhere else to turn. But to people who knew the city, the location did not look random at all. It looked like somewhere a person might choose precisely because of what that ground had successfully hidden before. Hae's body was recovered and taken for an autopsy, and the findings shaped everything that would follow. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was manual strangulation. Someone had used their bare hands to take her life. There was one more detail the examiner noted, and it has haunted this case ever since. There were no defensive wounds on her body. No clear physical signs that she had been able to fight back against her attacker. Over the years, that single detail has been interpreted in more than one way, and the honest truth is that we still do not fully understand what it means. The examiner also concluded that Hae had most likely died within hours of her disappearance, on the very same day she drove out of that parking lot. And that timing carried a cruel and lasting consequence for the investigation. Because her body had not been discovered for nearly 4 weeks, the weather had been working against the evidence the entire time. Wind, rain, cold, and the slow passage of nearly a month had quietly erased the kinds of physical traces that solve cases. Footprints. Fibers. The small forensic fingerprints that a fresh scene can provide. By the time investigators arrived at that grave, much of it was simply gone. No clear forensic profile of a killer could be pulled from the earth. But there was one thing missing from the scene that would prove enormously important. Her car. Hae's car was not at the park. It was found later, parked on a street in West Baltimore, roughly 10 miles away from where her body had been buried, and the keys had been left inside it. Stop and think about what that distance actually tells us. Hae could not possibly have walked the 10 miles between where her car was abandoned and where her body was hidden. Moving between those 2 points required either a second person or a second vehicle. Someone had made a series of deliberate choices. Someone had left her car in one location and her body in another, miles apart. This was not the chaos of a random, unplanned act. There was thought in it. There was effort in it. There was someone who had decided, step by step, what to do with her and with the things she left behind. And then, 3 days later, the case took the turn that would define it for the next quarter of a century. On the 12th day of February, the Baltimore police received an anonymous phone call. The caller did not give a long explanation. The caller simply told investigators to look closely at one particular young man. An ex-boyfriend from Woodlawn High School. That single anonymous tip pointed the entire investigation in one direction, and from that moment forward, it never truly turned back. Investigators moved quickly. They pulled the young man's cell phone records and began assembling a timeline of where his phone had traveled on the day Hae disappeared. They spoke with one of his acquaintances, a young woman, and she pointed them towards someone who was much closer to him. A close friend. And not just any friend, but specifically the friend who, on that exact day, had been borrowing the suspect's car and his cell phone. What that friend eventually told the police became the entire backbone of the case. According to his account, the suspect had confessed to him directly. The suspect had said that he had strangled Hae. And according to that same account, the friend had not merely heard about the crime after it happened. He claimed that he had personally helped to bury her body in that park. On the 28th day of February, that friend walked into a police station and gave his statement. On the very same day, the ex-boyfriend was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was 17 years old at the time. And the decision was made that he would be tried as an adult. Now, here is what made this case so deeply contested from the very first day, and why it would eventually tear the certainty out of almost everyone who looked at it closely. The case did not rest on a fingerprint pressed into a murder weapon. It did not rest on a signed confession from the accused. It did not rest on a single eyewitness who actually saw the crime take place. More than anything else, it rested on the word of one man. The friend. And around that one man's word, the prosecution constructed a detailed and specific story. In their version of events, the killing happened fast, inside a window of only about 20 minutes in the early afternoon. The suspect, they said, then called his friend and met up with him, and opened the trunk of Hae's own car to show the friend her body. Because the friend had been borrowing the suspect's car that day, there were two vehicles available to them. According to the prosecution, they moved Hae's car to a parking area. The friend then dropped the suspect off at an after-school sports practice, so that the suspect would be seen going about his completely normal routine, building himself an ordinary alibi. Later that evening, once it was dark, the two of them returned, and together they buried Hae in the park and abandoned the second car across the city in West Baltimore. To support this story, the prosecution presented a few key pieces of evidence. There was a map found in a vehicle, with a page corresponding to the burial area torn out of it. There was a partial palm print connected to the suspect, found inside Hae's car. And there was cell phone tower data. The prosecution argued that the location records from the suspect's phone placed him near the burial site on the evening of the murder, lining up with the friend's account. On paper, laid out cleanly like that, it sounded almost complete. A motive. A witness who claimed first-hand knowledge. A palm print. Phone records. A jury could look at that and feel they were standing on solid ground. But here is the problem. Almost every single load-bearing piece of that case has a crack running through it. And those cracks are the entire reason that you and I are still sitting here talking about this case more than 2 decades after a jury delivered its verdict. Let us start with the central witness, because everything ultimately rests on him. His account did not stay still. Across multiple interviews with police before the trial, important details of his story shifted and changed. The location where the suspect supposedly showed him the body moved from one telling to the next. The sequence of events rearranged itself. By the time the case finally reached a courtroom, the version that a jury heard was smoother, cleaner, and far more certain than the earlier, messier versions had been. Now, I want to be fair here, because fairness is the entire point of a channel like this one. A story that changes under questioning is not automatically a lie. Human memory is genuinely unreliable. People misremember details all the time, and fear and trauma can scramble the order of events in anyone's mind. But this is exactly the kind of shifting foundation that should make any thoughtful person cautious before stacking a life sentence on top of it. And there is one more thing that matters enormously about this witness. He received an agreement that allowed him to avoid prison in exchange for his cooperation. Which means he had a powerful, personal reason to give the prosecutors the account that they needed to hear. Now let us talk about the cell phone evidence, because this is where it gets even more troubling. The phone company itself had attached a disclaimer to the very records the prosecution was relying on. It was a written warning, stating plainly that incoming call data was not a reliable way to determine the actual physical location of a phone. And yet the prosecution leaned heavily on incoming call data, using it to argue that the suspect's phone, and therefore the suspect himself, was near the park. That warning, from the phone company itself, was sitting right there inside the case file the entire time. And at trial, it went largely unchallenged. The one piece of so-called scientific evidence came with a warning label, and that warning label was almost completely ignored. And then there is the witness who was never even called. A classmate of the suspect came forward after his arrest. She said that she had seen him in the school library in the afternoon, during the exact window of time when the prosecution claimed the murder was taking place. She remembered it specifically and clearly, because of what the two of them had talked about that day. She said that she was willing to come to court and testify to what she had seen. She put it in writing. And then, for reasons that have never been fully or satisfactorily explained, the suspect's own defense attorney never put her on the witness stand. A witness who could have placed him somewhere else entirely, at the critical moment, and the jury never heard a single word from her. That defense attorney's conduct became a scandal of its own. The suspect's very first trial actually ended in a mistrial. At the second trial, his legal representation was later judged by a court to have fallen short of the standard the law requires. That same attorney was disbarred the following year over separate complaints from other clients, and she died a few years after that, without ever explaining the choices she made while defending him. And yet, despite every one of these cracks, the jury reached its verdict early in the year 2000. They convicted him on every single count. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. False imprisonment. Robbery. He was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 30 years. He had only just turned 18. For almost any other case in America, that would have been the end of it. A verdict. A sentence. A file closed and shelved and forgotten. This was not almost any other case. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this shocking story all the way through, because what happens next is the part that turned a local Baltimore murder case into a global obsession that has lasted for over a decade. Trust me, you do not want to look away now. For years after his conviction, the young man kept fighting from inside his prison cell. He insisted, over and over, that he was innocent. He argued that the evidence had been mishandled and that his own lawyer had failed him when he needed her most. And for years, almost no one outside the city of Baltimore was paying any attention at all. He was just one more convicted name in one more closed file, fading into the background of the system. That changed completely in the autumn of the year 2014. A journalist released the first episode of a podcast that took this single case and pulled it apart, piece by piece, week after week, thread by thread. And she did something genuinely difficult and genuinely brave. She did not declare him innocent. She did not declare him guilty. She refused to hand the audience an easy answer. Instead, she laid the entire case out in the open. The shifting story of the central witness. The warning label on the cell tower evidence. The library witness who was never called. The timeline that never quite fit together. And then she asked, out loud, the question that had been buried for 15 years. Does any of this actually hold up? And the world answered. The podcast became a global phenomenon, one of the most listened to programs in the history of the format, downloaded by millions upon millions of people across the entire planet. Strangers who had never set foot in Baltimore became consumed by it. They argued about it at work and at dinner tables. They took sides. They built online communities. They reinvestigated the case from their own living rooms, poring over maps and timelines and transcripts. For the very first time, the question of what truly happened to Hae Min Lee was no longer a private grief contained within one city. It had become an international obsession. And it is right here that this story stops being only a murder case, and becomes something almost without equal in modern legal history. Now I want to reveal who this man is, and what has actually happened to him, because even after everything I have already told you, the truth of where this case stands today is genuinely difficult to believe. The man the state of Maryland convicted, not once, but twice, is named Adnan Syed. After that podcast aired, the legal machine that had gone silent for years suddenly roared back to life. In the year 2016, a judge vacated his conviction and ordered a brand new trial. That decision was upheld on one appeal, then overturned on another, and in late 2019, the highest court in the United States declined to take up his case at all. Once again, it looked like the final word had been spoken. It had not. In September of the year 2022, after prosecutors said that their own fresh review had uncovered new evidence and serious problems with the original case, a judge vacated his conviction for a second time. He walked out of prison that very same day, after spending nearly 24 years behind bars. Weeks later, the prosecutors formally dropped all of the charges against him. For one remarkable moment, in the eyes of the law, Adnan Syed was a completely free and uncharged man. And then it reversed yet again. Hae Min Lee's family challenged the way that hearing had been handled, arguing that they had not been properly notified or properly included in a process that was deciding the fate of the man convicted of killing their daughter and sister. Hae's brother, Young, the same brother who had loved her since childhood, carried that fight through the courts. And in August of the year 2024, the Supreme Court of Maryland reinstated the conviction in a divided ruling, and ordered the entire process to be done again, properly this time. The conviction was back. But Syed remained free while the courts worked out what would come next. The final turn, at least the most recent one, came in the year 2025. The Baltimore prosecutor's office withdrew the motion that had tried to clear him, stating that the previous administration's filing had contained false and misleading statements. And then, in March of 2025, a judge reduced his sentence to time already served, under a state law that gives people who committed their crimes as minors a pathway to release after long years of incarceration. He was placed on 5 years of supervised probation. Now listen very carefully to this part, because it matters more than anything else. He is free today. But his conviction still stands on the record. And the ruling that allowed him to remain free was not a finding that he was innocent. It was a decision that, after more than 2 decades, he was no longer considered a danger to the public, and that the interests of justice were better served by letting him stay out rather than sending him back. So where does that actually leave the question we started with? Convicted. Freed. Reconvicted. Released. And through every single one of those dramatic reversals, no court has ever named another suspect. No other person has ever been charged with this crime. Adnan Syed continues to maintain that he did not do it. Hae Min Lee's family continues to maintain that the conviction is sound and that justice was correct the first time. And the rest of the world remains split right down the middle, exactly as divided as it was on the day that podcast first aired. Which brings us all the way back to where we began, and to the person this story was always, truly about. In all of the noise, the appeals, the podcasts, the documentaries, the worldwide headlines and the endless online debates, something terrible happened. It became frighteningly easy to forget that at the very center of all of this is not a legal puzzle to be solved for entertainment. At the center of this is a girl. Hae Min Lee was 18 years old. She had a brother who has now spent his entire adult life fighting for her inside courtrooms he never wanted to be in. She had a mother who crossed an ocean for the promise of a better life, and who buried a daughter instead. She had a little cousin who sat waiting at a daycare on a cold January afternoon for a ride from someone who always showed up, and who simply never came. She has never received the one thing that every victim deserves. A final, settled, honest answer about who took her life, and why. More than 26 years later, that answer still does not exist. And until the day it finally does, this case stays exactly where it belongs. Open. So this is my last request to you, and it is the most important one. If you believe that Hae Min Lee deserves to be remembered as far more than a famous case, as a real person who mattered, then leave a comment below with her name, Hae Min Lee. I read these comments, and it genuinely matters that her name keeps being spoken. And if this story moved you, share this video with one person who cares about the truth the way you do, and subscribe to this channel with notifications turned on, because there are far too many names like hers, far too many people the world forgot too quickly, and every one of them still deserves to be remembered. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Thank you for caring about the human being behind the headlines. This was the Cold Case Archive. Take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.